So, good evening, everyone. I'm sure all of you are keeping safe and healthy and started running your normal working lives. And of course, you have planned your next adventure trip or holiday with your spouse and the kids to your favorite destinations. Well, we are living in a very interesting era, a world where central bankers are in whatever it takes mode. Global central banks are pushing the limits of unconventional monetary policy. In the US, the 10-year real rate is minus 1%. In Germany, it's minus 1.3%. In such an environment, as a global investor, how do you invest in a way that preserves your purchasing power? Well, the US fiscal deficit is also at record highs, and so is the US debt to GDP. The narrative of US losing its exorbitant privilege, the so-called end of US exceptionalism, is gaining traction. How much should you read into it? And are there any alternatives such as gold or cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin that you can consider to mitigate that risk? Or it has become a herd trade? Well, if you are a domestic investor, the backdrop is equally challenging. In an attempt to steer the economy out of the pandemic induced shock, the central bank has chosen to prioritize growth and overlook the high inflation prints, terming them as transient. It has cut repo rate to record lows and has flushed the banking system with too much of liquidity. It has also embarked on a massive bond buying spree by way of OMOs and outright purchases in the secondary market to ensure that the government borrowing goes through in a non-disruptive manner. This has had some major ramifications for all the asset classes. Short-term rates have plunged to record lows. The operating rate is currently the reverse repo rate, which is at 3.35%. This has pulled returns on overweight and liquid funds to levels never seen before, and the one-year FD rate in several PSU banks are sub 5%. Well, given the uncertainty around the economic recovery, one is skeptical buying corporate bonds, going long credit too. Equities have seen a massive rally from the lows at the current levels. Valuations look overstretched. The outlook for the global commodities too is very uncertain, as one would wonder whether reflationary trades have run its course. Some say we are in a massive long-term bull run in commodities. So which asset class should you pick given a two-speed recovery or so-called K-shaped recovery? Which are the sectors you should go overweight in the next economic cycle? These are some of the questions we will try and find answers in today's session. But one thing is for sure, the current environment is heavily skewed towards, against savers and in favor of borrowers. This definitely need to rethink and revisit your investment strategy in the world where real rates are likely to remain negative for a foreseeable future. If you do not, then you risk losing your purchasing power of money. My dear friends, I'm Abhishek Goenka, CEO and founder of IFA Global and Treasury Elite. Once again, we are here to celebrate our very own 10th edition of Treasury Elite Conclave. And the topic for today's discussion is investing during COVID times, a look at strategies, markets, and assets. After having 9 successful editions, Treasury Elite has become one of the most sought and close-knitted community of treasurers, CFOs, fund managers, CEOs, and promoters. I'm extremely overwhelmed, humbled, and excited with the kind of participation we get from the entire financial community. Thanks for being here and supporting this noble cause of Treasury Elite, whose main objective is networking, knowledge sharing, and mentoring. A special thanks to all our guests and members who have taken out time to be part of this special occasion. Of course, we miss the warmth of our old format of shaking hands and grand gatherings. But of course, on a positive note, we are getting used to this new normal, and more people are able to hear from such wonderful speakers that come with us. Treasury Elite is known to have some really knowledgeable and wonderful speakers in the past. And today, once again, we have an amazing speaker. Today, it will be a one-on-one format of 45 minutes with our speaker. Well, our speaker and moderator do not require any introduction, but I'll call upon Dr. Brinda Jagirdar ji, our governing council member, one of the very well-respected names in the field of business economics, to introduce our speaker for the evening, Mr. Saurav Mukherjee, and our moderator for the evening, Mr. Govindraj Ethiraj. Over to you, madam.
Thank you, Abhishek. It's indeed my pleasure to introduce both our guests today. Mr. Saurabh Mukherjee is a founder and chief investment officer of Marcellus Investment Managers, a portfolio management service. He is the former CEO of Ambit Capital and played a key role in Ambit's rise as a broker and a wealth manager. When Saurabh left Ambit in June 2018, assets under advisory were $800 million. Saurabh was educated at the London School of Economics, where he earned a BSc in Economics with first class honors, an MSc in Economics with distinction in macroeconomics and microeconomics. He is also a CFA charter holder and a SEBI registered investment advisor. In London, Saurabh was a co-founder of Clear Capital. In 2007, he was rated by the Exeter survey as one of the top small cap analysts in the UK. In India, Saurabh was rated as the leading equity strategist in 2015, 2016, and 2017 by the Asia Money polls. In 2017, upon SEBI's invitation, he joined SEBI's Asset Management Advisory Committee. Saurabh has written 3 best-selling books: Gurus of Chaos, The Unusual Billionaires, and Coffee Can Investing, the low-risk route to stupendous wealth. So we are all very excited to hear you, Saurabh. Welcome this evening.
Thank you, Vrinda. Thank you.
It's also my pleasure to welcome Govindraj Ethiraj, our host for the evening. He's a well-known television and print journalist who has reported and written on Indian business for over 25 years. He's a media executive and entrepreneur whose ventures are safeguarding the transparency, accuracy, and integrity of news in India and worldwide. He's the founder of Boom, a fake news busting initiative that tracks and debunks viral hoaxes in real time. He also founded the award-winning India Spend, a public interest journalism outfit which uses data to write and syndicate stories in areas like health, education, and environment. Govindraj was named a 2018 McNulty Prize laureate for his leadership with Boom, India Spend, and Fact Checker. He anchors seasonal shows on Bloomberg Quint and was earlier with a weekly Policy Watch on Rajya Sabha TV. Prior to television, he worked in print in Business Standard and the Economic Times. He is a fellow of the inaugural class of Ananta Aspen's India Leadership Initiative and a winner of the 2014 BMW Responsible Leaders Award. So welcome to both our guests today. Thank you.
Thank you, Brinda. Thank you very much for having me. Saurabh, always a pleasure to speak to you and speak with you. And I also know that you always seem to have some fresh insights on the markets in general and markets and behavior of investors in specific, among other things. So, Saurabh, let me ask you, I mean, I spoke to you a few months ago. At that time, I was asking you about why are the markets going up when everything else is going down? I guess the question still stands. And maybe we can use that as a starting point, So what do you see happening around in terms of the way markets are behaving in equities and to some extent, by extension, overall markets, which also our audience today is interested in knowing. And why is it or is it not reflecting what's happening in the underlying economy, particularly as impacted by COVID-19?
Thanks, Govind. Thank you for interviewing me today, and thank you to IFA Global for inviting me today. It's a Friday evening, so always the sort of nicer part of the week to be having these discussions. So let me sort of frame my response to your question in sort of 3 different ways, right? There is seldom anything new under the sun. And in a way, one of the sort of very interesting facets of your life, Govind, is to sort of, cut out this inane chatter that now pervades mainstream media. And whilst Goenka Saab's introductory address was beautiful, his address was the kind of typical mainstream media type of view that the world is changing. It's all drama out there. If you look back at the last 100 years or indeed the last 30-40 years, the underlying structural trends are actually very, very clear, right? So I'll lay out the longer term trends and then we'll discuss the specific context of COVID. The first trend is over the last 40 years, our country's economy has been relentlessly monopolized, right? So pretty much every sector we care to think about is now dominated by one or two companies who take home 80-90% of the profits of the sector. And for the country as a whole, barely 20-25 families now take home 80-85% of the country's profits, right? So this is almost double from what it was 10 years ago. So a decade back, the top 20 companies took home 40% of India's profits. And if we look back to say 1990, the top 20 families took only 15% of India's profits home. So we've created a very monopolized economy, and it's unlikely that COVID will stop that. If anything, as I'll discuss in a minute, COVID will hasten the monopolization of the Indian economy further. The second trend is, if you look at the last 100 years, repeatedly, consumption has bounced back very quickly from exigencies far deeper, far worse than COVID. So if you look back at, say, exactly 100 years ago, 1918, the Second World War ended. Then you had the Spanish flu, which wiped out some 15 million lives. Right? Today we're sort of, gasping at horror, a million lives. The Spanish flu wiped out 15 million lives. And yet by 1922, consumption in Europe and America was back to where it was in 1919, and then both continents, especially the United States, had 10 years of runaway GDP growth and a roaring stock market. Look back at the Second World War. Within 6 months of the Second World War ending, consumption rose to 3% growth. 3% growth in consumption in the 30s, 40s was enormous, both sides of the Atlantic. And then through the 40s into the early 50s, consumption was very healthy. The 50s and 60s turned out to be the two best decades immediately after the Second World War for both Europe and America. Look back at Lehman Brothers. Within 3 months of the Lehman Brothers crisis ending, US and European consumption started rising again. And as some of you will know, in the 10 years following Lehman, consumption has grown at a faster rate than in the 10 years prior to Lehman. And the S&P 500 or the FTSE 100 have done better in the 10 years after Lehman than in the 10 years prior to Lehman. Now, this is actually quite explained in economics by something called the permanent income hypothesis, which says that most people, when they are faced with an exigency like COVID, they realize this is a passing phase. They take a longer term view of consumption, and therefore consumption comes back relatively quickly and stock markets bounce back. So those are the two long-term trends. One is the relentless monopolization of the Indian economy, and second is the robustness, the resilience of consumption to exigencies far more serious than COVID exigencies like war, like the collapse of the global financial system. And if you now come to the current day and link it back to the discussion you and I were having on your show, I think 3 months ago, the point I was making is you can quite easily see how COVID is playing out. What's happening in many sectors, whether it's banking, whether it is paints, whether it is baby milk powder, whether it is Hawaii chappals, whether it is undergarments, what's happening is the market leader is gaining market share by around 10 to 20%, right? And if you gain market share by 10 to 20%, it almost inevitably means that by the end of this calendar year, your profits will be back to where they were roughly a year ago. Your competition would have been decimated. And as you come out of COVID, your competition is unlikely to be able to catch up, right? Especially if the exit from the more prolonged the exit from COVID is, the greater the loss of potency on the competition's part. And we can see this. The easiest example I can highlight to you is HDFC Bank. HDFC Bank is repeatedly reporting credit growth in the vicinity of 20-21%. The RBI is telling us system credit growth is 6%, which immediately means HDFC Bank's market share is pulling through. And we're seeing this trend in sector after sector. So the long-term structural trend of monopolization is being hastened further by COVID, and the easy access to capital, which our host Goenka Saab explained. The easy access to capital is helping the monopolist more than it is helping the Chotu. The Chotu is on his way. Anyway, the Chotu was on his way to bankruptcy. COVID hastens the exit of the Chotu and the rise of the Indian monopolist.
Right. Okay. So yeah, if you were to look at asset classes overall now, and maybe take a step back and take a slightly global lens, what's been happening? I mean, if I'm assuming things are following the structural path that you've just outlined, but how would you say things have shifted so that someone can maybe try and understand what's changed and what's not?
So it's unlikely that there'll be some, it's unlikely that COVID will trigger some major structural change in the relative returns of various asset classes. So as Goenka Sahab explained at the outset, if you see not just the last 6 months, if you see the last 40 years, the US 10-year bond yield has headed down in a straight line. So in 1980, the US 10-year bond yield was 16%. Today it is zero, right? And it's been a steady decline, right? And it's been driven by what we now call QE, but the US central bank, and following America's lead, the Bank of Japan, the Bank of England, the ECB, now our RBI, following America's lead, central banks around the world have realized that the path to salvation for a central bank, the path to salvation lies in opening the monetary floodgates and driving down bond yields into the ground, and thus driving economic prosperity. Right now, one of the big unknowns in economics is why this 40-year downward trend in the cost of money hasn't fueled inflation. It's a longer debate than one we can have today. But I think that journey continues. As the Fed, the ECB, and the BOE have made abundantly clear, they will keep the cost of money, the short-term interest rates in the Western world, will stay close to zero. And as long as that happens, the RBI will keep lowering the interest rate. I think rightly so, and I've discussed this matter at length with the people who run our monetary policy over the last several years. Rightly so, the RBI will throw inflation out of the window and focus on keeping money cheap. One of the points I've repeatedly made since 13th March, since the market hit the gap down, is if you look at India's 40-year trend, every single Indian economic recovery comes in the immediate aftermath of a US recession. Our country has never had an economic boom without a US recession. And looking at it another way, there hasn't been a single US recession in the last 40 years which hasn't been followed by a boom in our country. So it's ironic, much as our policymakers would like to tell you and me that they're this kind of incredible fount of wisdom and dynamism, our booms come from America. The reason for that is twofold. Cheap money. When the Fed floors interest rates, the RBI drops rates by a proportion. Typically, a US recession drives down the US 10-year bond yield by 2 to 3% and permits the RBI to cut that much. This has happened in the early 80s, the early 90s, the 2003 to 08 period, the 2008 to 11 period, and it's happening again. This year, RBI, US 10-year bond yield is down by 2.5%, which is exactly the amount of rate easing we've seen. So US recessions give us cheap money. And the second thing a US recession gives us is cheap oil. Right? Because America is the world's largest consumer of oil. So an American recession typically means a 50 to 80% drop in the price of oil, which in turn filters through to our country, which in turn allows the RBI to be even more aggressive in rate easing because it takes out pressure on the currency. It takes off pressure on the monetary policy. So we are in India's sweetest spots come in a US recession. We are in a US recession. You cannot now double guess. You can't now second guess the economic recovery. India parties when the US goes into recession. The 2 or 3 years immediately after US recession are India's Goldilocks moment. Basically, we party on cheap oil and cheap money. We party for 2 to 3 years. Then our own economic inadequacies kill us. The fact that we don't have a skilled labor force, our land markets are illiquid. So we tend to party for 2 to 3 years after a US recession. Party time has begun.
And how do you see the present phase, Saurabh? So, for instance, I was watching the debates, and of course, Trump feels that the economy is good or as good as it can be, despite everything else, and will bounce back. Our own economy is down. We are at a 10% contraction, and obviously things will bounce back because of a lower base. So. Where are we in that point? Are we, I know we are partying in some areas, but is the party kind of, is it a broad-based party, so to speak, across asset classes? Is the party still to come in the true sense, or is it already over?
So there's two different angles to what you're asking me, Govind. I think I'll unpack your question.
Yeah.
One is the question on politics across the world is unfortunately quite straightforward, right? There's plenty of data across the last 40 years. Indeed, there's plenty of data within India that countries that educate their people, give them healthcare, give them protection, prosper. Countries that don't educate their people, don't feed their people, don't give them protection, they struggle, right? So if you look within India, that's true. States which have done a better job on education, on healthcare, on law and order have done better than states which aren't. And if you look across the world, East Asia being the sort of the most shining example, you give your people education, you train them, you give them reasonable healthcare, they go on to build prosperous lives. Now, the challenge that we have with politics the world over is what I just told you is bloody hard to do. It's hard work, no? It's far easier to open the monetary floodgates, flood the economy money, and then stand on top of the tallest mountain and say, "Dekho maine kya kiya hai," right? And that's become the ruling paradigm across the world. There's no great difference. And most disappointingly, Govind, it doesn't matter whether the party is on the left or on the right, in the West or in the developing world. Politics globally is now a very uniform game. You debate on issues of identity and ethnicity rather than issues of the sort we are debating here. So it's sort of great for people like us, to debate this on a Friday evening. But politics, the elections are fought on other issues, as we well know all too well. But the benefit of that to us as investors is it does not matter who wins, right? It becomes irrelevant because the policy paradigm is scarcely moved by the politician. The politician did not win in the first place by offering economic panaceas. Economic panaceas come from the central bank, which is print money. So since the policy paradigm does not deliver economic panacea, you and I as investors can safely look through elections and focus on the broader structural trends, which are the rise of the monopolist, the continuation of cheap money, and the rise within economies of powerful companies who can swing policy in their direction very convincingly. So much as the US election is great entertainment, but as an investor, it's not of any great consequence to me.
Right, and if you look at, for instance, let's say the shifts that policy has caused, maybe it leads to more monopolization, as you say. But for instance, COVID-19 and even 4 years before that has seen shifts of supply chains away from China. So which means
it's a lovely point. So Govind, I think this is one of the things you should do from a boom perspective. I've looked at the data quite carefully over the last year. This whole point about shift about China, there is no data neither on FDI nor on FPI to suggest that there's any grave migration out of China, right? So it's actually very interesting. If I am a Western politician, I can get some cheap votes by beating the Chinese bandwagon, highlighting to respectable newspapers in the Western world as to how many ways I'm imposing tariffs on China. But if you look at the flow of capital or of goods, there is no tangible evidence that the tide has turned against China or in India's favor or in UK's favor. The last 4 years of data on capital flows, both on FDI and on FPI, are very similar to what they were in 2011 to 15. So what's happening? The political discourse you and I just discussed 2 minutes ago is then impacting the media discourse, right? And to give the politician credit, the politician is being able to convince mainstream media that have created a fundamental shift, right? And the media is buying it hook, line, and sinker. I'm not just talking India, global media. So you read the FT, the Economist, the Wall Street Journal. It feels like the op-eds are written by the same people. And it's the same op-ed repeated in the FT, the Economist, and you compare that op-ed with the data that's available on FDI and FPI, and there is no relationship. Right, so it's really, really worth looking at these political debates as entertainment, rather than taking it seriously and discussing in the boardroom. What should we do? Global supply chains are changing.
But Saurabh, that means you're also saying that the shift in globalization, and I'm telling you why I'm asking this question. I'm asking because a lot of, let's say, Indian companies, for instance, I was talking to someone in the IDMA, Indian Drug Manufacturers Association. They're saying they're under a lot of pressure from this government to move production to India of drugs. So somewhere the policy begins to have a real impact, or at least a perception that things are going to change, and therefore I have to invest, which means I have to look at my own ability to raise capital, ability to redeploy maybe resources that I have, and plan. I mean, things change.
Sure.
So you're saying that this at least is the data is not reflecting that as of
Absolutely.
now.
So there's a different way to see policy, right? And I've tried to sort of, it's hard to explain how to see policy in the context of corporate life when there are 160 other people listening. But I'll try to give an example without being too controversial, given that this is being recorded. Uh, there are two different policy paradigms you need to think of. One is this public discourse that gets printed in newspapers and hawked to people like us, such as China supply chains, on which the data is frankly nebulous, right? These are PR stories sold to burnish political images or sold to serve political causes, on which the underlying data on FDI and FPI is not suggesting a structural change. But the more meaningful policy changes, Govind, the more meaningful lobbying that happens with very powerful monopolists, lobbying regulators and heads of states across the world, that piece never makes it to the newspapers, right? Because that is done very quietly. And increasingly across the world, whether it's in the United States, whether it's in our country, one of the classic monopoly tactics is to swing policy quietly and swing it in your favor, right? So to take case in point, the antitrust against Google, right? Why did it happen, right? If you read the documentation on the House of Congress's antitrust committee, it's a 440-page report. They've been working on it for years. How come the antitrust against Google gets filed 3 weeks before a US election, right? Because if you see that the report itself was published, the 440-page report was published, I think 4 months ago, right? And you read through it, and you realize that this investigation has been underway for 5 years. Why was it filed today? Now, there are similarly potent policy changes underway in our country, right? They're being expedited quietly. There is no media discourse. They can't be, right? The corporations are so powerful, they will completely shut down the media, which tries to highlight these policy debates. So my submission to this august audience is, look through the headlines. The policy changes that matter to you, to your companies, to your commercial interests, are not the policy changes that you'd read in the newspaper headlines. The ones that matter to you will never make it to the headlines. You have to use your own business intelligence sources to figure out which regulator is being tweaked in which way by which monopolist, and how can you protect your corporate interests by doing counter lobbying. Right, so there's a Washington DC famously is a city of lobbyists. New Delhi too will become a city of lobbyists.
Okay, no, so just to come back to the point about monopolization and the party which begins in India, as you said, as the US goes into recession. Now, my earlier question to you was, where are we in that party mode? Are we halfway through that party mode?
Yeah. No, so we're beginning, right? So we're beginning, and you can see, right? You can see the link. So the US 10-year bond yield around Jan was around 2.5%. It's close to zero, I think, as a host mentioned. In real terms, it's negative, as Goenka Saab rightly said. Given that the US 10-year bond yield has fallen, if you look at our yield curve, right, the short end of the yield curve has fallen almost by as much as the US 10-year. The long end has fallen a little bit less because of concerns on inflation. But the result is companies with strong credentials in the bond market are borrowing money at some of the cheapest rates I've ever seen them borrow money. So an NTPC, a Reliance in the bond market, Bajaj Finance or HDFC in the commercial paper market are borrowing money at some of the lowest rates I've seen them borrow. Now, let's maybe take a sector where I can sort of give a like-for-like example. Bajaj Finance borrowing money at 4.5%. Even other credible NBFCs, which are non-monopolists, say a Shriram Transport or Chola, is borrowing money 150 bips, sometimes even 2% more. Right? These are credible, respectable NBFCs. There are 10,000 NBFCs in the country. By the time you get to the 20th or 30th NBFC, the cost of borrowing is more like 8-9%. Right? And if the market leader is borrowing at 4.5, an HDFC or a Bajaj Finance is borrowing at 4.5, and you're borrowing at 8 or 9, you obviously are not in the game anymore, right? So this exemplifies how the easing of policy in America is helping the market leader in India, whether it is Reliance in the case of telecom and they're borrowing in the market, an NTPC in the power sector, or a Bajaj Finance HDFC in the NBFC sector, right? So we have just begun that party. What this will do is it will allow the leader to crush the follower over the next 1 or 2 years, right? Let's just to continue with the NBFC sector example. Obviously, there'll be NPAs in the sector, right? At the moment, the NPAs are being hidden by a restructuring and morat and
moratorium.
The Supreme Court kind of saying you can't recognize an NPA, right? So all of that is hiding the NPA. The NPA will come, maybe it'll come in the quarter to March or it'll come in the quarter to June. But as the NPA comes through, the market leaders already loaded up on cash and equity, right? As you can see, the market leaders are also raising equity. So when the NPAs come through, the weaker NBFCs will obviously die, right? As it is, they are borrowing money 200, 300, 400 bips more expensive. Uske upar, they will be buckled by NPAs next year. And thus you'll consolidate the NBFC sector, which is one of the few unconsolidated sectors in our country. Bajaj Finance market share, I think, is around 2-3%. So what you therefore see is a very sort of transparent monopolization triggered by COVID, triggered by the cost of money dropping by 2.5% courtesy the United States, which helps the Indian monopolists get money cheaper. In a way, if I were to put it very in one line, the monopolist gets the upside of the crisis, the follower gets the downside of the crisis.
Right, and the one thing that's changed in this let's say journey is the fact that the monopolists are becoming bigger. The party factor is of course consistent, as you said, for many decades, but the monopolists are becoming bigger. So what does this mean for the non-monopolist? I mean, I know you say that you illustrated the NBFC sector, but of the many people who are watching right now, I'm sure that they don't all belong to those 5 monopolies or 4 monopolies in each of these sectors. So what do things look like? I mean, how does it play out from here? And is there any I don't know. Is there any cheer from what's happening?
So I think the clarity of thought always leads to better actions. So the way I've sort of seen it as an investor is, you basically figure out, if you're working for a non-monopolist, you figure out what can I do which allows me to earn a return on capital above cost of capital, right? If you look at our stock market as a relatively representative slice of the economy, you see that 90% of listed companies in our country never earn a return on capital, never ever earn a return on capital above cost of capital, right? Now, in an era where the PSU bank would sort of fund you because they liked your face or you called a politician, you could get by. But that era is gone in our country. The PSU bank is struggling for tier 1 itself. And even if they had the tier 1, they're not going to give you money unless you're able to show a solid balance sheet. So as a non-monopolist, you have to figure out, how can I run my business so that I can get my return on capital to around 15% mark. If I can't get it to a 15% mark, call up a corporate financier and look for an exit. The quicker you exit, the more money you'll get for it. The longer you delay the inevitable, the less you'll get for it. Now, there's no sort of, you would like to think we're unique in this regard, but we aren't. Other countries who've been through our phase of evolution have been through this sort of savage crunching, right? So America went through it between 1880 and 1930. Japan went through it in the first 40 years after the Second World War. Korea went through it between 1970 and the turn of the century. And we are going through it. We're probably 10 years into our journey of consolidating our economy. So if you look at Korea today, I suspect India 20 years from now will look like Korea today, where 5 families in Korea, LG, Samsung, Hyundai, and a couple more, control 75% of the economy. So we will go in that direction. You and I can't sort of stand against the tides of economic change. What we can do is, as rational business people, say, can I figure out a way of generating a return on capital above cost of capital? If I can't, then it's time to exit, get as much as I can for my assets, and then do the best as I can as a supplier to a monopolist. These monopolists are obviously going to need thousands of suppliers, right? So just say the example of a HDFC Bank. It's $100 billion market cap today. I suspect a decade hence market cap will be pushing around $1 trillion mark. HDFC Bank will have thousands of suppliers. If you can be a supplier of a specific niche product to HDFC Bank, you'll have a pretty decent life. But you got to understand that and say that this is the niche I belong to. This is the monopolist I will focus on supplying, and I will grow like that. That's how the Japanese economy functions. Toyota itself has some 5,000 suppliers who earn a living just by supplying suppliers to Toyota. We will build an economy along those lines.
Right, and that's very useful, Saurabh, for I guess for more than one listener today. So tell me, you gave the Korean example, and you said how things will converge towards these five families or chi-balls, as they call them there. Now, and which also sort of links to the next question that I wanted to ask you. So Korea reached a certain point, and they're a developed country now. And you're also saying that we may be like Korea. So were you saying the economy as a whole, or just those the trend of monopolization? And the second question, which follows from that, is where are you seeing the economy today beyond the monopolies, the monopolization, and the big companies?
Sure. So it's actually worth watching Japanese movies from the 60s. And unfortunately, I haven't seen Korean movies from the 60s, but I've seen plenty of photographs of Seoul from the 60s. So I think a few years back, there was this hit song called Gangnam something. And my kids
Gangnam Style. Gangnam is a suburb. It's like
Gangnam is a suburb.
Seoul.
So I saw a picture of what Gangnam looked like in 64. And it looked like, properly looked like, worse than most suburbs of Bombay. Right, and that was 64. That wasn't some dark and distant era. Korea's industrialization started broadly around that time, right? And obviously, if you just Google Gangnam and see Gangnam 64 and Gangnam today, in 50 years, the face of Gangnam has changed beyond recognition. So we will also go through a similar phase in our existence. Now, will we do that across our country, or will we do that in certain pockets? My reckoning is it'll be specific pockets. It'll be those parts of the country where levels of education, levels of law, the prevalence of law and order, the prevalence of training systems are better. And much as I would like to say, we'll have, the prosperity across 1.4 billion people, it does look relatively clear that the states of southern India, Maharashtra, potentially Gujarat, the NCR region, perhaps Odisha, will pull ahead of the rest. And this is where the kind of work you do on India spend is very useful. I don't have that granularity of data, so we are big sort of fans of what you do, because we know the journey, right? The journey will be, maybe 24, unlikely to be more than 24 monopolist families will drag the country forward for their selfish benefit, right? That's how development happens. We got to understand that, no country, develops by sort of, socialism. So these monopolist families will drag the country forward with their might, with their money and their capital. The country will therefore develop along the lines of the way Japan and Korea have done. But it's unlikely that we see prosperity across the country. There'll be pockets of enormous prosperity where levels of education, law and order, healthcare are better, and then there'll be pockets of lower income, and those will become much like, say, a United States or a Italy, where there's prosperous parts of the country and there are broken parts of the country.
Okay, let me bring in some questions, Saurabh. So Rushabh Sherdalal asked, so which economic indicators do you look at to know whether the market as a whole is moving towards overvaluation?
I've never really lost too much sleep on the Indian stock market. I've said this in lots of places. 80% of companies in India publish fabricated numbers. So you want to look at the Indian stock market, feel free, but I've never understood the fascination with looking at the market. Even if I had any, Nifty's 0% EPS growth over 1, 3, 5 and 10 years has killed it.
Okay. Pankaj Bajaj asks, is it not counterintuitive that on one hand we have nationalism and deglobalization, but on the other hand, cheap money will flow more looking for returns and markets?
So as an investor, I don't really get too caught up in all this nationalism, deglobalization. I just told you, those are media stories fed to keep the Janta entertained. The data doesn't suggest deglobalization.
And that's very interesting. I mean, and it is a trigger for me to sort of go back
So Govind, I'll give you a further thing that I think is very relevant for what you're doing and relevant for everybody else. So it's worth stepping back and asking why are these narratives trotted out by mainstream media, right? And my reckoning is part of it, and we saw this in full play through March when the mainstream media created wild panic around COVID, right? It was difficult to find any newspaper anywhere in the world which wasn't fomenting panic around COVID, right? So why is it happening? And my reckoning is this. What's happening is social media is putting a lot of pressure on mainstream media, right, to be relevant. Because social media is saying we will report the news quicker than you can. By definition, social media will do that, right? So mainstream media is asking us, well, how do we stay relevant? The easiest way to stay relevant, the laziest ways to stay relevant perhaps, is to get everybody scared. Make everybody scared. Say some blooming disaster is about to befall you unless you read my newspaper. If you read my newspaper, Govind, I'll take you through the darkness and show you the light. But if you don't read my newspaper, you're on social media, boss, God help you. Right? And that's why I think the underlying pressure, the relentless structural pressure on mainstream media will make them prone to this behavior where they'll keep selling you narratives of doom, and it's incumbent on people to make up their own mind.
Okay. Nirav Shah says gold and real estate have been over 90% of India's investment. Are there any examples globally which can be referred to understand how these asset classes will monetize in the coming decade? How will it ultimately affect the financial markets in India?
So you don't have to listen to me on this. There's a superb RBI report on their website. So this is their policy is so beautiful. No media channel ever writes about this RBI stuff. It's on their website. It's called the RBI Household Finance Committee report. It's a gorgeous piece of work. It's probably the most comprehensive piece of work done on this subject. So quick summary of what it says. It says that we have 95% of our wealth, our household wealth in physical assets. Only a mere 5% in financial assets, which are around $500 billion. Our financial assets at the household level, astonishingly, 70 years into independence, is a mere $500 billion. It further says that no other country in the face of the planet has this sort of skew. It then uses an euphemism for black money. It doesn't say black money because I guess that's a kind of sinful phrase. So it says euphemistically, this is probably due to black money, which is either overwhelming preponderance of wealth being in physical assets is black money. It then says it's highly likely that as more Indians retire, people who started working in the 80s head towards retirement, we will tilt towards financial assets because obviously you can't fund anything, right? You can't forget about your retirement. You can't fund a holiday to Ooty with a flat in South Bombay now, right? So as you head towards retirement, right, we will invest more in financial assets. The question is at what pace? Right, so we did some homework around this. At what pace will we financialize our savings? A lot rides on the answer, including our stock market. So one way to gauge this is to read the Credit Suisse World Wealth Report. It's a free publication. You'll find it on the net. They publish it every year. And it looks like most countries that are per capita income tend to have a 85-15 split. So 85 in physical, 15 in financial. So if you assume it will take us 10 years to get there, we're at 5% financial. Assume it will take us 10 years to get there. So we grow at 1% a year. 1% of our household wealth. So our household wealth roughly, I reckon, is around $10 trillion. So 1% of 10 trillion is $100 billion a year. So we will keep accreting financial assets. By financial assets, I mean life insurance, pensions, health insurance, motor insurance, mutual funds, the whole gamut. We will keep accreting them at the rate of $100 billion a year. And if you follow that trajectory, then obviously you realize from having a mere $500 billion, we potentially end up with triple that amount a decade hence. And that pool of savings then basically drives the economic development process, right? And this is how countries develop. The only fly in the ointment is the bulk of that extra $1 trillion will go to the dominant monopolists who will have the first call on that capital, so to speak.
So you've used the term monopolists in a sector agnostic way, but if I were to flip that around, where would you think the monopolists thrive or are likely to thrive? How do you spot a monopolist coming up?
Sure. So the book that I learned the most from in this regard, right? So what happened was we were sort of seeing the India data. The India data is quite easy to collect. You go to the Ministry of Corporate Affairs site, you collect data on all Indian corporates, and you can see the fact that 20 companies now drive 75% of profits. That's easy to collect, right? We were scratching our heads till a couple of years back to say, why is this happening? And then we found a couple of, we read American history to understand why this happens. We found a book by a guy called
Alan Greenspan.
No, not Greenspan. This is the rise and fall of American growth by Robert Gordon. Alan Greenspan is very much mainstream, commentary.
No, he wrote a book on American capitalism recently. So maybe I thought you were referring to that.
I will go and read that now. But Robert Gordon, The Rise and Fall of American Growth, and he described the monopolization of America between 1870 and 1930. And then we read Peter Thiel's, reread actually Peter Thiel's 0 to 1 to understand how the modern great American monopolies were created. The Facebook, Amazon, Google, Netflix. And once we read 0 to 1 in 2016, we were immediately able to link it to what's happening in our country. There are broadly two ways companies across sectors are building monopolies. One is the regulatory construct we discussed 20 minutes back. Right? You basically work with the regulator and chup chap, you tilt the regulatory playing field in your favor. You make sure no newspaper, TV channel, or WhatsApp covers this. That's not very hard to do, right? And there are several families which have sort of deep domain expertise in this regard now. The other area is technology, right? And there are broadly two ways to build technology monopoly, and you can see both at play in our country. One way is the kind of Purana Indian way, where you do process chemistry, you take bright chemical engineers from UD City or the IITs, and you do process chemistry, you come up with some intellectual property which is privileged to you, which is specific to you, and you use that IP to drive your monopoly. The other is data, right? So in the last 20 years, we've seen the rise of Indian data science monopolists. I would submit that, say, companies like HDFC Bank or an HDFC Life or a Dr. Lal PathLabs or a Bajaj Finance or an Asian Paints or a Pidilite, their dominance, by dominance we are talking about 50, 60, 70, 80% dominance in the sector, is driven by deep expertise in collecting more data than anybody else has done, parsing through the data and spotting profit pools that nobody else can see. Right now, it's there, because they've done the hard work, they are justified in reaping the benefits. What you and I get as customers actually is very interesting. We get a better deal, and this is where I think the Google antitrust case by the DOJ will be very interesting. I think Google's central case will be, show me what I'm doing wrong, because I'm giving Govind free search, right? And I'm giving world-class search free. Dikhao where I am abusing my dominant position, and obviously there'll be the Department of Justice which will put forward its case. Similarly, in India, one of the most fascinating things about the great monopolists is none of them hike prices by more than 1 to 2% a year, right? And one of them explained this to me 4 years back. He told me that they could sort of use your brain, right? So for middle class bongs like me, this is always an education to talk to these people, right? He told me, Dekho, costs in India rise at 5-6% a year. If I can keep my prices, say, at 1 or 2%, the delta between 6 and 2 is 4. Over 5 years, I will bankrupt my competition. Right? And that is lethal because it is so compelling. He's using scale efficiencies. He's using data science. He's using data science to gather scale, and he's using scale to crush cost, to crush working capital. His rivals can't do that. They are consigned to history. He becomes a 5, 10, $20 billion worth individual. And this paradigm is very powerful. These people obviously don't come on mass media and spout this. Why should they? They carry on making money. People like me do the talking.
Okay. Devesh Maheshwari asked, how long will this, I guess it links back to the party, recession party question. How long will the QE and the low interest rate fuel markets?
So look, you don't have to ask me, the Fed is making it abundantly clear. So every 3 weeks, they tell the world, we'll keep it zero for another 2 years. So I think if somebody asks what indicators I watch, I wake up in the morning, sit here with a cup of coffee, and I read what the Fed said or the ECB said. And these guys are making it abundantly clear that we will keep money free for the next couple of years. So if that doesn't get your animal spirits up, then difficult to see what else can.
Okay, Vatsal Sharma asked, what are your opinions on the popular theory of Ray Dalio when he says cash is trash?
So, I'm sure he's a great man and I'm sure he's right, but I benefit from that, right? I explained to you how I benefit from it. I invest in companies who use cheap money to pulverize their competition, and I buy their shares and I make money. And you can do so as well. It's not just privileged to me. All of us know, all of us can check which companies are borrowing money cheapest. We can then check which companies are deploying this money, deploying their capital for the best possible return on capital. If you then do a simple spread calculation, ROC minus cost of capital, and you go and buy the 20 stocks with the highest ROC minus cost of capital, you will make a lot of money, right? It's the simplest thing to do in finance. So one of the very interesting thing happened 2 days back. So my 12-year-old daughter, she's a bit of a baker. She loves baking cakes, and through the lockdown, it's kept us all fed and her entertained. So she told me 2 days back, she said, Dad, I figured out why you tell people that free cash flow is the spread between return on capital and cost of capital. So I said, why is that, Mishka? So she said, it's very simple. If I bake a cake and I sell it for 150 rupees and the ingredients cost me 100 rupees to buy, then 50 rupees is what I make from. 50 rupees is my free cash flow from the cake. So I thought this is a sort of revelation for me. Middle class born girl learning business at the age of 12. We are going somewhere in the world.
Okay. Bharat Mosadi asks, Musadi, at a macro level, your thought process is very good, or rather, he tells you that, Saurabh. However, I'd like to get a sectoral view on the growth in the post-pandemic world, which will vary.
I've got no idea, Bharat. I mean, as I said, I'll sort of do a quick recap on how we look for companies, how you can look for companies. We're not fussed about sectors, right? I don't have any great love for one sector or any hatred for other. What we look for is, firstly, we look for promoters who steal money and we weed them out. Unfortunately, the majority of promoters get weeded out. Perhaps the word is wrong, but they get filtered out. So firstly, we look for promoters who are doing naughty things with their books, and we say over there. That leaves actually no more than 60 or 70 sizable Indian companies in the picture. Amongst those 60 to 70 companies, we do a basic sense check to make sure that these people are selling products that the majority of Indians need, right? We're not really that interested in niche products because if you want to manage a lot of money and have a long growth runway, we need mainstream products. And the third test is this test that I apply of monopoly. There are two ways to do this. The quantitative way to do it is look for returns on capital which are above, say, 20-30% for long periods of time. What you typically find in India is the top 20-25 monopolist families, their return on capital. By return on capital, I mean EBITDA divided by debt plus equity, or EBITDA divided by fixed assets plus working capital. The top 20-25 monopolists have EBITDA in their have pre-tax ROC in the vicinity of 40%. Right now, I don't look for 40%, but what I've typically found is if you look for ROCs above 20%, the typical company you find has ROC of 40%. So the quantitative way to look for monopolists is look for companies with 20, 30, 40% ROCs over long periods of time. And if you find one, you almost certainly have found the monopolist. The qualitative way is the way I described. Look for companies who've captured regulation or captured technology or captured data. Right. The challenge with this latter method is, their investor relations officer is not going to tell me on the phone that, Mr. Mukherjee, I would like you to know we have captured the regulator. Right. He's not going to tell me that. So it's easier to do it through the ROCE way. Right. You look for companies with high ROCs sustained over long periods of time. As I said, we found 25 such families, 25 such companies, and we've gone forth and invested in roughly half of them.
Nirav Hemani says, we know you're a listed equity investor. How do you see the startup space disrupting the corporate leaders? Or maybe another way of asking the question is, how are you looking at what could potentially disrupt the monopolists?
So if you look at there are two different development paradigms I think we've seen at play in the world over the last 50 years. The first is the American paradigm, which people in India seem to be very familiar with, right? And what you see in the US, if you take the US economy, what you find is the top 20 US companies by profits, they only control around 25-30% of American profits, i.e. America is not a monopolized economy, contrary to the perception created by the FANG stocks. Right? So that's the first part to realize, that the American paradigm seems to be genuinely fairly powerful in generating competition. Even if you're a chota sa startup, you can go to Silicon Valley, get money, and then the banks will finance you. And then one day, 10 years, 20 years out, you list on Wall Street and become a multi-billion-dollar company. The Asian paradigm isn't like that, right? So Japan, Korea are not economies which have this paradigm. Japan, Korea, as I said, are very concentrated. Taiwan too. Japan, Korea, Taiwan are very concentrated profit pie economies. Now, as Govind, you said half an hour, 40 minutes back, these economies are no less dynamic, right? We all know the power of the Korean economy, even the Japanese economy in delivering world-class, innovative, high-tech products. But the way innovation happens in Asia is very different from the way innovation happens in America. In America, it happens through the classical startup route. In Asia, it happens by you're creating something very valuable, and then a Sony or a Honda comes and buys you, right? So much of what we are doing here, right, on this Zoom interface, on my laptop screen, on say your iPad screen, the sound technology is all owned by Sony, but it's unlikely that they created it in-house. A nifty Japanese startup came up with it, and a Japanese or a Korean giant gobbled it. So that's how LG and Samsung work. And what's very interesting is increasingly we are seeing the powerful Indian corporates work in a similar fashion. They're saying, I will seed you, Mr. Startup. If your technology works out, I will buy you. Right? And that's how Asia will work. So there is just because 15 families will rule our country doesn't mean that we will be somehow left behind. Korea and Japan have shown you can have 5 to 15 families driving industrialization, and innovative startups end up selling themselves to these giants. So we will, I think, more likely follow that model rather than the Silicon Valley model, which is why I'm a little wary of using my modest expertise and my limited balance sheet to go and invest in startups.
Right. Okay, but that's that. But it's a good point. I mean, I have heard this elsewhere as well, that the big, even the Ciscos and the Intels, I mean, some of the biggest, after they grew up to a point, all their subsequent innovation really came from startups that they gobbled up, and not from the core team or not from the original organization, so to speak.
And those of you who are interested more, just read the House of Congress Antitrust Committee report on the American tech giants. It was published in August. It's there. I mean, they've given you 440 pages of how the American giants deal with startups. Unfortunately, there is no such report by the Japanese or the Korean regulator. Something tells me there might not be, and it tells you everything about what you need to know about how Asia works versus how America works.
Right. One of the last few questions. Rakesh Barucha asks, so why do most fund managers not beat the index, or why are they not able to beat the index?
I mean, they own pretty much I presume you're referring to mutual funds, Mr. Barucha. So most mutual funds own the index. If you own the index, how will you beat the index? Right. So by me, that I mean, if you can go to, there are plenty of websites which tell you what stocks sit inside which mutual fund. You'll see they pretty much own the whole Nifty. So if you own the whole Nifty, how will you beat the Nifty? Given that we just discussed, right? Nifty's earnings growth over 1, 3, 5, and 10 years has been close to zero.
Okay, so then, therefore, how do you beat the index, and what can one do, or how does one deploy one's capital?
So of course, the Indian monopolist 1, 3, 5, and 10-year earnings growth is 20%. So Indian monopolist 20, Nifty 0. So if I could, I could create the Indian monopolist index, and Mr. Barucha could buy that, and you could ignore the index which compounds at 0 and buy the index which compounds at 20%. Right? I'm not being facetious. It is indeed as stark as that.
Yeah.
So let's just step back and think about it. Right? Over the last decade or so, the country's GDP has grown at around 6% real terms. You add around 3% of inflation, we've had around 9% nominal GDP growth, right? And this is even if you're a cynic about government statistics, we've had around 9% nominal GDP growth. What's happened is the fruits of that growth have gone to 20-25 families whose profits have risen at 20% per annum. The rest of corporate India, 6.5 crore companies, profits have risen at 0 or 1%. Now, what this tells you and me is GDP growth per se doesn't do anything. It's the ability to use your financial resources to go and grow your company is what fundamentally drives corporate prosperity and market cap, right? Now, how do you go and finance your growth? You have to generate free cash flow. How do you generate free cash flow? You generate a return on capital significantly higher than your cost of capital. How do you do that? That's where the barriers to entry come in. And what a select few families and promoters and CEOs have done in India is thought this through, very clearly, implemented it, efficiently, ruthlessly, I would argue, and made themselves extremely wealthy. And their dominance, their era will continue for the next 20 years.
Let me put the last point to you before I hand back to the organizers, Saurabh. So you talked about two books that you read. One is, of course, the Peter Thiel book and the Gordon Brown. There was a question as well. Is there a book that you're reading right now, or any books that you would recommend at this point?
So look, I mean, if you want, to the extent I can talk about these, I can write about these things, what I've told you. I've written as much as I can in a book called The Unusual Billionaires. It was published in 2016, and I explain there how great Indian promoters have built incredibly powerful franchises. So if you now, there's another facet. There's actually, given that we've got plenty of CFOs and CEOs, one of the most fascinating aspects of business, which are very rarely written about well, is capital allocation. Right, a big part of this monopolist thing that I'm talking to you about is the smart use of profits, right? The redeployment of profits in an extremely canny manner. Now, unfortunately, other than this book that I published in 2016, Unusual Billionaires, I haven't read a really good book on capital allocation in India. But if you want to understand how the smartest capital allocators in the world function, there are two books you should read. One is a Patla book, an extremely good book. It's called The Outsiders. It's a book called The Outsiders by a guy called William Thorndike. He's a private equity fund manager in Texas. So he wrote about 7 American companies that outperformed GE by 20x between 1970 to 2010. Basically, in that era when GE was the largest company in the world, there were these 7 American companies which outperformed GE by 20x. And it's a book on how smart promoters allocate capital. And the more I've understood great Indian promoters, I've realized they are basically capital allocation supercomputers. In their brain, in 5 minutes, they can figure out kahan pe paisa lagana hai, kahan pe nahi lagana. Unfortunately, there isn't an Outsiders written for India. It would be tremendous if somebody did it. But you can read The Outsiders for understanding of how great capital allocators work. And if you want to see the creation of a titanic monopoly, then the best book is the book on Amazon, The Everything Store. The guy who wrote it is called Biz Stone. So the literature is primarily coming from America.
Brad Stone or Biz Stone?
Biz Stone.
Biz Stone, yeah. Okay. Interesting point, but just since you mentioned GE, there is an epitaph to GE as well, right?
Yes. So GE in a way shows the end of the Purana paradigm. The Purana paradigm in the American case was the conglomerate which tried to do everything, but as we now know has ended up basically doing nothing. And there's an American company which is in a way the mirror opposite of what GE is doing. I forget, it's a manufacturing company which is basically building, it's one of the largest manufacturing companies in America, which is using the cheap money from 10 years of QE and going and acquiring smaller manufacturing concerns. It's turning them around and making tons of money from it. I wish I could remember the name. It'll come back to me one day. But for now, GE's decline, I think, mirrors the decline of many Indian conglomerates who had fingers in lots of pies, thinking that this is a right idea. And what the Indian conglomerate is finding is, I'm doing 8 different things. I'm doing well in 2 areas, but in 6 other areas, my performance is so bad, it's dragging down my return on capital below cost of capital. And gradually the financial markets are sort of killing these companies, much like GE's demise. So the rise of the pure play monopolist in India, in a way, comes at the expense of the decline of the traditional Indian conglomerate.
Right, and that's a fascinating point, Saurabh, and one to end on as well.
Danaher, yeah, I think somebody, Neeraj Jitwania, has very helpfully pointed out Danaher. So just if you want to see the next generation of monopoly capitalist, look at Danaher. Incredibly smart company, right? It's fascinating to watch it from a distance. They're doing everything right where GE did it wrong.
Right. Thank you, Neeraj. Thank you, Saurabh. Always a pleasure talking to you, and thank you. My extended thanks to IFA for inviting me to host this conversation with you in these very, very interesting times. Abhishek, it's back to you.
I think, Abhishek, you're on mute.
Thank you so much, Govind. It's always lovely to hear your questions, and Saurabh gave a wonderful insight today. And Govind, I think you have to go, so I would once again thank you. And we always enjoy talking to you and hearing your insights, and the way you pull the entire audience and the questions is phenomenal. I'm sure nobody feels discriminated.
Thank you, Govind. Thank you very much. It was awesome.
Thank you, Govind. And Saurabh, a few more questions. We'll just take 2-3 questions, and then we'll let you go. So one thing, as often said by experts, like for example, Ray Dalio, there is a proportion of asset allocation. Like he says, this much of debt, this much of equity, this much of commodities, and this much of bullion. Now, India is in a situation where the interest rates are down and currency depreciates and inflation is up. So somehow people are a little confused as in what is a good asset allocation. So at least they get a 10-11% post-tax kind of a return. For a layman, somebody who's in his 30s or 40s, what should be a good asset allocation?
Okay. So I think a couple of things to realize, right? A lot of people in our country do this asset allocation thinking that there is some risk return frontier. A lot of people are fans of CAPM. If you do the crunching in India, CAPM does not work. It does not work in theory. It does not work in practice. There is no correlation in India at all between beta and returns, right? There is no correlation between higher risk and higher return. In India, you take high risk, you're bankrupted. In India, you want to get rich, you take low risk. Okay? So once you realize that CAPM, SHAPM, business school mein time pass ke liye achhi cheezein hai, and in India, you have to take low risk to make lots of money, life becomes very simple. You look for the lowest risk investments which can give you the best returns. And the answer to that would be, given what we discussed, dominant monopolists.
Monopolist.
Right? Sector uski hai, country uska hai, paisa to wahi banayega na. Koi unknown chotu ke thodi na banayega. So, jokes apart, in all seriousness, it is really, really dangerous to take Western finance theory from 50 saal pehle, 1950s, 60s mein, Chicago School or MIT mein, they created CAPM, and we've unthinkingly taken it and applied it in our country. A whole generation of Indians' wealth has been wiped out by CAPM. Right? Even now, people are continuing to apply it. Risk reward frontier, ye allocation, wo allocation. My thinking is very simple. Buy stocks which have low risk, both risk in the sense of strong balance sheet, strong cash flows, and also risk in the sense of stocks with low volatility, low beta, and sit on them. You will make good money in India. Some people were asking about retirement. Your retirement, your treasury, sab kuch fund ho jayega. Right? And if you want to, for say, aapke company ne allow nahi kiya equity lena, or you're running some insurance company and you can't buy equity, then in the bond context, in the corporate bond context, apply the same paradigm. Look for low risk corporates. Corporates, not ratings wise. Low risk in the sense of strong balance sheets, strong cash flows, credible accounting, and buy their bonds. That superficially lagega ki yield to maturity thoda sa kam hai, but that's also just as misleading as the PE multiple. So whether you're a treasurer doing corporate bonds or you're doing equities, look for low risk investments, look for monopolists investments, and prosper as the monopolist rises in our country.
That's a very, very interesting takeaway, Saurabh. In fact, you'll be surprised that most of the billionaires, when they actually take risk, they always talk about low risk and high return. It's never high risk and high return. And if you rightly put it, and I think that's a very, very important takeaway for everyone. So I'll put it to Jitendra. Jitendra, one question from your side.
Hi, Saurabh.
Hi, Jitendra. Hi there.
Hi. I have a background for infra, and we have discussed this matter time and again. But let me, just take this question once again back to you.
Anji.
So in entire discussion, you put a focus on the return on capital should be higher than the cost of capital. Cash flow should be free, available,
Anji.
and there should be visibility of cash flow, not only to survive the business but to grow the business.
Anji.
That's the key takeaway I've taken from you. Look at the other way around from infra point of view. Last 7 years, every government, every budget, every policy is putting focus on the infrastructure, capex, government-led, because that will kickstart the economy. In one sector where the cash flows are not visible, ROE is not clear, no new players are coming in, how do you say that this sector will flourish and that will kickstart the economy?
Hanji,
Because that entire theory is not fitting into the free cash flow.
absolutely. So, bilkul, sir. So, Sujendra ji, you're absolutely right. I think one of the things we all have to realize as sort of investors is we get paid to invest in the world as we find it, not to invest in the world as we would wish to find it. Right? We're not paid to invest in some utopian dream wala future, जो शायद आज से 40 साल बाद आएगा, right? So we get paid to invest and make money in the world as we find it. ठीक है? Now, if you look at infra, right? Typical Indian promoter, even the mightiest of promoters, अगर आप cost of debt or cost of equity blend कर लो, you're looking at low double digits. ठीक है? Mightiest promoter, low double digits. It is not likely, not feasible that most infra assets will generate a return on capital of low double digits, right? मेरे ख्याल से मुमकिन नहीं है. Infra assets छोड़ो sir, a high rise in Bombay, an office high rise in Bombay can't generate a return on capital of low double digits. ठीक है? So forget about a highway, forget about a mass infrastructure, railway station, highway, rail track, even a commercial office building in BKC is unlikely to give you a return on capital higher than your cost of capital. Okay? Now, logically, therefore, that money has to come from people who have cheaper capital. Cheaper capital kahan pe hai? Either Bharat Sarkar ya Videshi. Right? So either Bharat Sarkar ya Videshi. Now, as it happens, the allocation of responsibilities broadly is working out. Bharat Sarkar takes the construction risk and the Videshi buys the asset once the construction risk is off the table. Right? And that's, I think, how the infra paradigm should have been built a long time ago. And that's how the free market will force it to be run. Bharat Sarkar with construction risk, because they can borrow money at 5%, 6%. Ek bar construction risk is off the table, then for the annuity yield of 5, 6, 7%, 8% shayad, I think if we are in a fantasy scenario, 8% hoga, the foreign pension fund for the 8%. Right? Anybody else who has any other utopian fantasy, they're welcome to it. But हम जैसे लोगों के दिमाग के बाहर है, कैसे कोई सोच सकता है कुछ दूसरा?
One question from your side.
Yeah. So as Abhishek mentioned in his opening remarks that we are going to look at negative real rates in the near foreseeable future, and you too mentioned that this abundant liquidity is going to keep rates low or negative. In such a scenario, what would you say to savers who are dependent on, say, interest income, or they want to who are investing in fixed deposits? What would you say to them? But another, just one more.
Lovely point, Vrinda. I think this is relevant for all our families, right? My relatives are have been asking me this question for the last 5 years, and my point is what I've been saying for the last hour. Monopolist पे निवेश कीजिए, because just think about it, right? Average Indian की life expectancy is 76. That's the average Indian. People in your and my social strata are living till 85. Typically, they retire at 60. So they have 25 years of retirement to finance. If they do this kind of standard fixed deposit, LIC policy, वगैरह, that's giving them after tax, if I'm generous, 5%. Right? Cost of inflation for you and me is 7%. Right? So every year, your wealth is being eroded. If you do the standard traditional Indian retirement planning, right, which is जाके भर लो अपना झोला FD और LIC से, right? If you do that, 2% per annum, your wealth is being depleted by. Over 25 years, 2/3 of your wealth will be gone. Right? So it's not right, man. And a lot of people are, I'm glad you asked the question, a lot of retired people are doing this. And they're just consigning themselves to misery in the last 10 years of their life. And obviously it's like slow death, right? Because it's not apparent. Every year, inflation's eroding your wealth. The fact that inflation is 7 and your post-tax rate of return is 5 is eroding your wealth by 2% an annum. Compound that over 25 years, 60% of your wealth will be wiped out by the time you die, right? And if during that 25 years you've used your savings to finance your lifestyle, there's a very high possibility a lot of Indians in your and my social strata will end up running out of savings before they die. So it's really, really imperative that folks like Abhishek and other wealth managers across the country get this cult of investing in high quality, powerful, cash rich companies into the minds of people in your and my social strata. This is not just some creed that I preach to high net worth individuals. I try to convince my own relatives to do this because there is no other tarkeeb. Now think of it slightly more strategically. If I am a powerful industrialist in any country, it's in my interest that money stays cheap, that interest rates stays cheap, and I will lobby, I will exert enormous political might, किसी भी देश में, to keep money cheap, because it helps me. Because I, as the dominant monopolist, get paisa sasta. The chotu doesn't. But as you rightly said, the implications of that on people in our social strata is enormous. And I don't think most Indian middle class people, upper middle class people, have clocked onto this. वो पुराना एसेट एलोकेशन लेके बैठे हैं, फ्लैट और ज्वेलरी और ये LIC लेके बैठे हैं. It's going to be seriously difficult for them in the years to come.
Okay, one quick last question. Also, you've talked very extensively about the monopolist. Now, look at India's situation. We have a large young population, and going forward, we'll need to create a lot of jobs. So, can we really afford this model that you talk about? It looks very unsustainable. So, how do you create the jobs? How do you give the chotu his place under the sun?
Right. So the chotu, as in the sense of the SME business, I think his future is as a supplier to the 15-20 mega corporates, right? That's if I look at Japan and Korea as countries, we might look like 20-30 years out. Their model is, you have giants like Hyundai and LG and Samsung, and you've got thousands and thousands of chota businesses supplying them, right? Now coming to the jobs piece, I have no easy answers. What I will tell you is this, that a lot of people, go through this mental cycle that you just went through. And having sort of read up on this over the last 100 years of history on this, I haven't found a single country which programmed this jobs piece. I'll give you the most stark example. In 1910, New York, there were no cars. There were only horse-drawn carriages. In 1910, New York, there were only horse-drawn carriages. That year, the Model T Ford was bought out, right? Ford ne gaadi nikali, Model T for first sasta mass market car. By 1930, New York had no horses. There was only cars on the streets of New York. In 1910, 30% of New York's workforce was employed in the horse car business, either riding the horse or cleaning up the horse or whatever. 30% of the workforce was in the horse business. 20 years later, there were no horses left. So these people had to be redeployed. And the free market labor force found a way to do it, right? So this predicting where people will get jobs is a task in impossibility. It is entirely possible that one scenario is very few jobs in the future, ho sakta hai, right? But that is a debate that politicians and policymakers need to engage in, not people like me, whose main job is to help people like you save for retirement successfully, right? So we need to focus on what we do best. Humko bhi monopolist banna, right? Rather than solving the problems of the world.
Thank you.
Excellent. So that was some very, very interesting takeaways, and especially the maths that you explained. I think it was thought-provoking. So I'll put it to Jitendra to give this closing speech, and then we'll let you go.
I have known Saurabh for the last few years, and many times we have discussed and debated many issues with him. I still remember a couple of years back when he came out with the reports of the corporate governance, and we discussed, in depth and debated many points on that. But the bottom line remains that every meeting, every interaction which I had with him was a learning experience for all of us, and obviously today was no exception. Such volatile world, uncertain markets, lot of ambiguity are facing us around. He has enlightened us with beautiful examples from both Asian markets as well as the US markets. He has discussed in depth about how the business cycle has unfolded, and apart from that, the financial market and the asset classes. I express my sincere thanks to you, Saurabh, for excellent insights and a great session. I also wish to thank our moderator, Govindraj Ethiraj. It was very clear. I was listening to him very, very clearly the way he was asking questions. It was not only, moderating and navigating the session, but in a way he was probing Saurabh. And that was clearly based on his knowledge and experience covering financial markets during his various media stints. We truly enjoy interaction moderated by Govind today. Like every other session of Treasury Elite, this time too, Team Treasury Elite and IFA Global have worked day and night and ensured best coordination for smooth conduct of the session. The team deserves kudos and compliments. At Treasury Elite, we believe that our biggest strength lies in the support from the wonderful audience like you. A big thank you to each participant for joining today and making the webinar a success. We look forward to see you again in our forthcoming sessions. Thank you all.
If everybody liked the webinar, just say why, so that Saurabh gets a round of applause from everyone, because the thuds won't be
Thank you very much.
visible. Lovely, Saurabh.
Really,
Thank you.
really
Thank you.
enlightening.
Thoroughly enjoyed every single point of yours.
Very kind.
And personally, I've had a lot of takeaways.
Thank you. Thanks,
Thanks,
Abhishek.
Saurabh.
Thank you, Brinda. Thank you, Jitendra ji. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Bye.